thank you for being here this evening. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sarah Foltz, and welcome to Foltz Fine Art. We are thrilled to have you with us tonight. We have 3 incredible exhibitions opening this evening. The first one that we will have an incredible artist talk by Billy Hassell. This is our 3rd solo show with Billy at the gallery, but our first one since the pandemic. So long time coming, and we're very excited to all be here this evening. We also have a vignette exhibition in the back featuring mid-century printmaker Janet Turner. Her wildlife works are absolutely exquisite. I know even Billy finds inspiration in some of her work and maybe collects it on the side a little bit too. But so please take a look at those as well. And then in the interior gallery, emerging Houston artist Sirena LaBurn, some recent works by her. We're in very good company with the other exhibitions. So again, we'll turn things over to Billy, but we're so glad to have you with us this evening.
Oh, thank you. Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it, and it's nice to see so many familiar faces and some collectors that go back a few years that I've become reacquainted with. And it is an interesting pairing. Pairing implies 2, but there are 3 artists in the show. And Janet Turner, as Sarah mentioned, is an artist that I became aware of a few years ago, and actually have acquired a few of her pieces. She was also a painter of kind of natural history, and started out, I think some of the works that I collected were hybrid prints from, I don't know when they were made, but probably the 80s and early 90s. And she taught for quite a few years at Stephen F. Austin in Nacogdoches. And I think her replacement was Mary McCleary, who is another amazing artist that has had presence here in Houston. But Janet's work it's about natural history, but it's also, she was a pretty innovative printmaker who combined silkscreen and lino cut and wood cut all in one print. And I think they're just very beautiful. So take some time to take a look at her work. And then, of course, Sirena LaBurn in the middle room. And she's relatively new, getting her work out and about. So, but we've had conversations, and we have a lot of sort of parallel thoughts about things and about the world, about the West. And so take time and take a look at her work as well. So this is nice to have what's always nice to have a show. And my work always ends up being about places I've been and places I'm familiar with. And this work is no exception. And I've been accused of being a landscape painter, and I do think there are landscape elements in my work without a doubt. But I think the works, in my mind, is more about the experience of being in the landscape and having, familiarity with the birds and the wildlife. And all of the paintings in this room have a significance for me, having traveled. My very first, I grew up in urban Dallas, and it was, I guess I learned about nature through books mostly as a kid. So my first real trip to a wild place was to Big Bend National Park. And I was 15 years old, and I had a friend who was 16, so he could drive. And actually, some of these I've more recently been serving on the board of the Big Bend Conservancy, which has been a really neat experience to learn more about the park, learn more about how, some of the difficulties of operating a federal park, and all the difficulties of raising enough money to maintain trails and maintain the park. But it's also given us a lot of excuses to go visit the park. And so I've spent more time in the park in the last 4 or 5 years. And there are several paintings in this room in particular that, like the Casa Grande Peak, that are specific experiences being in the park in more recent years. But then there's also a painting, I think it's in the other room, going into Juniper Canyon. And my first experience in Big Bend was a hike that was a pretty ambitious hike. I don't know if I could do it today, but it was hiking the South Rim Trail. And if any of you are familiar with Big Bend, you climb out of the basin over a peak, and it seems to take forever, all these switchbacks, and then you finally start a descent into a canyon, into Juniper Canyon. It's what I remember, and I have not made this trip since then, but I remember it was evening, and it was in April, and the mountain laurels were blooming. And you come over this point, and you see this boot-like formation that, if you've been to Big Bend, you're familiar with it, and it's been photographed a lot. But coming into the canyon, you get out of the heat and into this cool environment. And there's water, there's a spring, and I guess Juniper Canyon. What is this? Well, it's Boot Springs, named after the Boot Formation. And I think that experience, I was 15 years old, and it left an enduring impact. And so there's that painting. The into Juniper Canyon is an acorn woodpecker that they're common in the Chizos, and that's an old experience. And then this was just from a year or two ago, coming into Big Bend late at night. And my girlfriend, Bibi, and I both love skunks. And we saw wildlife driving into the park. So we were late. I'm always late. But we got into the park about 10:30 at night and drove up into the basin to check in. And there's a skunk in the parking lot. But from that parking lot, you can see Casa Grande Peak. And the next morning, I went back in to just walk into the lodge for some reason. And there were not just one, but a whole bunch of these acorn woodpeckers. And I realized they're not real uncommon. It's not like seeing some rare bird, but they're uncommon to me. And whatever it is up there, the oaks that grow in that particular altitude, they're I don't know, having seen that flash of red and the black and white inspired the painting of Casa Grande Peak. And then later, I guess my MO, my modus operandi is to see things and then figure them out later, like go research them and try to identify them. And discovered this interesting habit they have of collecting acorns and putting them in trees, and either cracks in trees, or I guess they poke holes in trees and put these acorns in there and store them for later. And then bears figure out that bears like acorns too, so they climb the trees and raid the woodpecker's acorn storage. And so those kinds of interconnections between wildlife has always interested me. It's sort of the survival of the fittest, but also sometimes it's mutually beneficial. But I also feel like these are sort of parallels of how people live in communities. We help each other. We take advantage of each other. We sometimes benefit. Sometimes we just have a complex relationship. And I think the animal world is very much like that. So I think wildlife is, for me, very much the animals are sort of like stand-ins for people. To me, they represent or symbolize that relationship that we have as human beings. So very frequently, the paintings are about communities, and we live in communities. And some of the paintings, the simpler ones, are usually like the Sphinx moth and the moonflowers. That's kind of a specific relationship of a type of flower that attracts a certain type of moth. And And I think I'm pretty sure moonflowers are poisonous. And so there's a kind of an edginess to some of this. You know, there's like a threat, even though there's some benefit, there's also always a threatening element. And I find that very fascinating. So, and I've been carrying this sketchbook around because I meant to bring more. There's one facsimile of a sketchbook in the display case, but my way of collecting material is the paintings are all done in my studio, but I carry these journals, like they're watercolor journals. It's good, high quality watercolor paper, and I kind of taught myself how to watercolor. In fact, this is the Smith Oaks Rookery, and I did this, I guess, 2 Junes ago, not last June, but June a year ago, on my first visit to High Island, which was, I can't believe I've never been there, but some other areas along the Gulf Coast. This was Candy, Abshire. I don't know if some of y'all are familiar with that. This was the Audubon, the kind of sand dunes. And actually this is up in East Texas near Silsbee. It's the longleaf pine preserve that's on land owned by the Texas Nature Conservancy. This is in Beaumont, but the name of the marsh escapes me. It's a little marsh that's Cattail Marsh. Thank you, Dario. Thanks for being here. Yeah, Cattail Marsh. I did this the day my show opened at the Art Museum in Southeast Texas spring a year ago. I'm sorry? Oh. I'm sorry, I'm focusing on this. So these, yeah, I use these as examples. This was a new state park, Palo Pinto State Park. But what I was getting to was this painting in the back corner. It's the one painting, and I probably shouldn't mention it, but it's the one painting that's not Texas. It's the Frying Pan River in Colorado. And so I did this watercolor of the Frying Pan River last July, late July, and I love the watercolor. And I think sometimes when I do a watercolor that I like a whole lot, it makes me want to do an oil painting. So, and while we were there, I saw these mountain bluebirds that happened to be pretty common around the river, and so they got added later. I changed the sky. I think I started out with this sky, and this is frequently how I work. I'll take the landscape itself will be the basic subject. But at some point, I think I saw, like we get incredible sunsets occasionally in Fort Worth, and I looked at some neighbor, I think, called and said, there's a good sunset. My studio at home is on the 2nd floor, and the clouds were just amazing. So I redrew it, and I mean, I'd already started painting it and completely repainted the sky, so that's the difference. But I just wanted to use this as an example of sort of how my process works, that I do almost always start with some kind of sketch or drawing. I don't rely on photographs much, except I will research birds and specific things that once I see them, I mean, everything's available on the internet now, so I find what I can and add things to it. So I think, I've got a few more pictures from this was also up in Colorado, Nest Lake, sort of near Chapman, also along the Frying Pan River. And then that's the Eagle River. I'm sorry. These are all Colorado. And then I'm back to Texas. This watercolor was just from a few weeks ago when we went up to the Caprock Canyon when I should have been home. Hey, George. I should have been home painting, but I was getting material. And I thought I might do a painting, and I will eventually do a painting. But there's one little watercolor in the back corner that's of the Caprock, same area, but more of a monochromatic study. But so that's kind of how the paintings, how they develop, how I get ideas, and then I moved to the studio. It's a very old, traditional way of painting, kind of like the old naturalists from the 19th century. And we could walk around the room. However, probably the best thing might be just to move sort of to the front. And I'll talk a little bit about this Smith Oaks Rookery painting. And the others you can just... Moving the lecture around is always a little disruptive, but thank you for working with me on this. So this was the first watercolor in this journal. And I had actually kind of forgotten about this, but I went out to visit High Island, and I guess it was I think it was June of 2021. And I don't know if you're familiar with High Island, but it's a really important area for birds. Well, the whole area, all the way across, even east of here or west of here, down in Wharton County and those areas. But incoming birds like neotropicals that come in from Mexico and need a place to land and eat. And so there fortunately are several preserves that allow for that. So the Smith Oaks Rookery is just one of many sanctuaries in that area. And I was looking at a satellite map of it recently, and it's really nice that it's preserved because a lot of those areas were drained for farming, and so a lot of that habitat disappeared. I think people didn't really appreciate the importance of wetlands. Wetlands was like you couldn't do anything practical with it, so why have them? But the birds need them. So I did this watercolor from one of the observation areas, and there were so many birds, and it was in June. So the big migrations had already happened. They usually happen between April and May. And I know there are people in the room that know more than I do about the birds and the patterns and behaviors of birds. But there are year-round populations of birds there, especially the herons and the egrets and the roseate spoonbills and the anhingas, the snakebirds. And so all of these birds were there when I was there in June, and they were on their nests with eggs. And so I just invested in a really nice high-powered viewing scope that I tried it out for the first time on that trip. And I was on the observation deck, and because it wasn't the peak season, there weren't that many people there, and it was on a weekday. But I could focus that thing, and it was just like being on one of those nature television shows where the birds were on a nest and they were feeding their babies like insects and dragonflies and things that you could literally focus. You could see the wings of these dragonflies. It was an amazing device to have, and I still haven't quite mastered the use of it. But the only downfall is, I'm sure I just wish I could take pictures while I was looking through it. But so I saw all these things, and of course underneath the birds are nesting, and then the babies sometimes come out of the trees, and there are always alligators and predators, possums and raccoons and skunks and things that are always there. But and this is I composed it from my memory, but it was also sort of based on this watercolor. And I'll just say this, if I can get through without getting too emotional. I think a lot of you are familiar with Frank Talbert, and this was one of his favorite places to go paint and go look at birds. And I knew that, and Frank and we've known each other for over 30 years. I'm afraid to admit this, but it's probably closer to 50 years. I think I met Frank in 1982, and I knew I never met his dad, but his dad was a writer for the Dallas Morning News and wrote a fascinating column that was besides the comics, was the other part of the newspaper I read as a kid. And so he walked into my studio one day when I first moved here. I had a studio down at the old original Diverse Works, which was in Old Market Square. And he and Ann walked in, and at that time, I think they were still living in Dallas. I mean, they kind of moved around between Dallas and Galveston and Houston, but eventually settled here in Houston. And I don't know how many years ago, when Frank started the Birds of Texas project, I'd already been painting birds for years, and I was, it was funny because Frank's style is so unique that first I thought, you're getting into my territory. Like, what's up with this? But he'd also been painting birds for years, and his style was so, I loved it so much. I mean, it was different and unique. I mean, I don't think anybody paints like Frank did, and it was so direct, and so I was sort of happy for the birds. You know, it's like, you know, it's just great when people take on, I'm in favor of any artist taking on natural history in any form whatsoever, just because I think it helps make people aware of natural history and the importance of it. So I was very sad when Frank passed away, and it was a surprise. I think, you know, we all thought he'd be around forever, and fortunately Anne is still with us, and she has an opening tonight in Dallas at Barry Whistler Gallery. So we've sort of compared notes and realized a few months, well, it's weeks ago anyway, that we couldn't attend each other's openings, unfortunately. But we'll see her soon, and I don't know, it was so fresh. I wanted to do the painting. I'd been thinking about doing this High Island painting for a couple of years, and I'm sure I'll do more. But since it was kind of his subject in the last few years, and up until the Grackles, and that I wanted to dedicate this to Frank. And then Bibi, my girlfriend, suggested just dedicating the whole show to Frank, and you know, honoring his memory and Anne's. And so that's kind of to explain the dedication. But I did have a really good time with this, and I feel like there's a lot of hope in this painting. There, like all the nests with the eggs are. It's, I mean, eggs always to me symbolize, you know, new beginnings, and I think in this case it's also, you know, we're dealing with a lot of birds. That's a lot of species of animals and birds have diminished in recent years, and I was reading a little bit about these, you know, some like around the corner there's a painting with Canadian geese and snow geese, and they've actually increased in numbers in the last 20 years. So I think some of the things that have happened in terms of being aware of protection and, you know, protection of habitats have had a real beneficial result for them. So and I think these others, someone asked about the boot and the boot springs. You were asking about that. So that's the painting kind of on that wall, the smaller painting, and that promontory, the rock going up that looks sort of like a cowboy boot upside down. That's the boot springs, the painting going into Juniper Canyon. Some of the others on that side and here are North Texas rolling plains where we live. We live sort of on the edge of that. And I'm just moving into a new studio that's out in that area, going up towards the rolling plains of North Texas. So the quail, and then I guess the other painting at the end, on the end wall down here, just happens to also be in the sketchbook. So most of the, and this also is a good example of how things change from a watercolor to an oil painting. And so this was a watercolor done at, it's called Sandylands Preserve. It's a Nature Conservancy of Texas Preserve near Silsbee. And they've, you know, longleaf pine was one of the most common pine trees all across the southeastern United States, from Texas all the way to Florida once upon a time. But the building, I mean, I'd be surprised if there's not longleaf pine in the rafters of this building. I mean, a lot of the old warehouses down off I-10, like I had a studio near the old Diverse Works before it, I guess it's moved since then, but the ceilings there, I think those ceilings were all made with longleaf pine. So it was a really valued building material to the point where it almost became logged out. And so they're, like the Nature Conservancy's found a stand up near, well, it's in the Big Thicket, and they've been sort of selectively clearing out other trees to encourage the longleaves to grow. So I did this watercolor, and then took the watercolor and did the oil painting, and that was I added the pair of woodpeckers, the pileated woodpeckers, which are common in that area. And at the bottom are sort of some of the flora and fauna that were pointed out to me, and the box turtle and some of the butterflies. But those were all native plants that I saw on that visit. So, so I guess that's kind of all I've got to say about the overall, the way I work, the way I get material. It's not all about natural history. I think, as I said before, I said that, you know, the animals all have a personality, and I think they're in a community of their own, and I think they do, to me, symbolize, you know, us as humans and the communities that we live in. So I think there's more to it than just, you know, trying to paint pictures of, you know, places. But it is also very much about place, and I feel like in my time alive, I've seen things disappear, and I guess in some way I'm trying to kind of preserve it and remind people of how fragile it all is. So, but I'm open for questions. Yes.
What took you from Houston to Fort Worth, or did you go straight to?
No, I didn't. I didn't go straight there. I was married at the time, and it was an opportunity for my wife at the time to. It was actually I moved from here to St. Louis, and lived in St. Louis for 4 years, and then she got another opportunity in Texas. She got another opportunity, and before I found out where it was, I was sort of like, I'm not going to move anymore, and because I liked St. Louis too, not as much as Houston, but it was a good town, and it had a lot of really nice opportunities for me. But it was Fort Worth, and I'm from Dallas originally, although I moved to Houston right after graduate school. Both my kids were born in Houston, so I feel like Houston is really home in a lot of ways, and I feel like it's. I still feel very connected to the Houston community, but Fort Worth has been a very, very good place to live too. And when I moved there 20 years ago, it was still relatively inexpensive, comparatively speaking, like Houston was when I moved here back in the early 80s. And so it's been a comfortable place to live. And, you know, it's close to a lot of things. It's close to an international airport. It's close to where I grew up. So a lot of my family and old friends still live not too far, but it's not that far to Houston and Austin and San Antonio. And it's sort of central, and it's just been a good place to live. So, yeah, that's a long answer to that question, but yes.
How long does it take to paint a painting this large?
Well, it seems to take longer and longer as time goes by. I worked for weeks on this, and actually I delivered it Thursday night about midnight. And it still had a few wet spots. It was typically about 2 weeks, I guess, on an average painting, but it just kind of depends. I mean, usually I would say roughly a month, and I frequently I'll start a painting and I'll work on it a while, and then I'll start another painting. And I have 2 studios where I work right now. One is just a bedroom at home that I have a wall that I paint on. And I have another bigger studio that I'll work in the morning and then kind of move. And it seems to help my head to kind of move away from something and work on something else, just to kind of break it up for me. But toward the end of this show, I was working on probably 3 or 4 paintings kind of simultaneously. And it really did help, because I'll get obsessed with one and just need to move away from it for a little while and go work on something else. This one I never got tired of. I kept thinking, I haven't put any dragonflies in it or bees or, you know, there's all kinds of things I could have kept adding to it. I wanted to put some turtles down there, but I just had to stop and, you know, be done with it. But this one did take a long time, but it's, yes?
Could you talk about the lithographs?
Oh, sure. The lithographs are, I guess they're a little bit older work. I mean, they're all done, you know, within the last, 5 to 10 years. But the lithographs started, I was commissioned by Audubon, Texas in 2003, 2004, to do a series of lithographs for projects that they're doing around the state of Texas. And it was designed to be a suite of 5 different prints. And I'd actually never done a lithograph before, so I kind of had an idea about how the process worked, and that's not true completely because I took lithography in college and I knew a little bit about the process. But I knew a printer in Austin, Peter Webb, who had a pretty good fine art press for quite a few years. And we had talked about working, like collaborating on a print years ago, back in 20, I guess, almost 30 years ago, and didn't work together at that time. And then, so we did I'm trying to think if that first print is in here. It probably isn't. But that's how I got started into the color lithographs. And then I love the process because with aluminum plate lithography, you can do as many plates as you want. The old stone lithography, you were kind of limited because most of those, like if you look at lithographs from the 19th century or the early 20th century, they're mainly 1 color or 2 or 3. Like a Toulouse-Lautrec might have 3 colors, just because it's labor intensive to add color if it's printed color. But when they developed aluminum plate lithography in the 60s, it was quick. There's a step in the process that these are light sensitive plates, so there's a photographic step, and that it's only getting the image onto the plate, and then the plate's all hand inked. But that enabled the printer, a lithographer, to print 15 or 20 colors instead of just 3. So as soon as I realized what the potential was for adding color, and I could make these lithographs look, or at least approximately look, like an oil painting in terms of color and saturation, I just went to town. So we did that first edition, and in between those first editions for Audubon, I did projects. I did several lithographs of my own, and then a few years went by, but I kept on printing with Peter. We did over 25 editions of lithographs over the years, and a lot of those editions are almost sold out now, but there's still a few of each. And then I think it was in 2015, Texas Parks and Wildlife commissioned me to do another set of 5 prints for same kind of project. They were doing these initiatives around the state, like reintroducing pronghorn into the Trans-Pecos area. I think Powderhorn Ranch, the one on the wall back here, was the first print I did for Texas Parks and Wildlife, and they knew exactly what they wanted me to start with because they had acquired this huge ranch down near, it's sort of near Port O'Connor, but in that part of the Gulf Coast, it was like 2,700 acres. No, it was more than that. It was several thousand acres of coastal prairie that was fairly intact. It had also been ranched. They had, it had been a cattle ranch, but it still had a lot of native grasses, and so they saw the benefit of preserving it. And it also had marshes and salt grasses, and so that was the first of that next 5 series of prints. And I think the redfish, well, that's I think that was the second print in the series, had to do with their artificial coral reefs. That they were using the detritus from offshore oil rigs to recreate artificial reefs, or at least an infrastructure that coral could build on. And I'd never had any experience 150 miles offshore. So that was the one exception of doing a print where I had to just do all the research and talk to wildlife biologists. And I got into all kinds of trouble on that print. They sent me images of things to work from, and I incorporated them all. And then I'd get these emails that were like, the wildlife biologists would go, well, you'd never see an angelfish in the same water with, a grouper, or it was like, well, it's artwork. It's not a scientific illustration. And then the coral, I went crazy with the coral because there's like a lot of different kinds of very beautiful coral, and I was sort of disappointed when they said those corals, they don't live together. You know, you've got to, so I ended up with the most common coral at the very bottom that was what was seemed to be growing on these artificial reefs. But anyway, that's sort of how I got into the lithography. And sadly, my printer moved to Spain, and so we're trying to figure out some way to either move into silkscreen, which would be easier to do long distance, or some other printing medium. But I do love printing, so yes.
Could you speak to the intense clarity of your light and color and where that came from? Is that what your eye sees? Because the light and colors in this area of Texas aren't this clear and intense and bright.
That's a good question. I know I consciously exaggerate color, and I do that for emphasis and I guess taking artistic license. But if you spend a lot of time outdoors, which I haven't spent as much time recently, but there are times of the day when you see these incredible colors. I'm sure you all have seen incredible sunsets where everything's just like, oh my God. And it lasts just for, it's just an ephemeral, like a moment. But in my mind, I sort of capture those, like, what was that? Especially the gradations of color and sunset and sunrise. And that's always in there working. But I also, looking closely at, at flowers and at the compositions of things. I think what our eye sees and what a camera captures are so different. And I mean, I'm always struck with how flat photographs look. Like when I take a picture of something, I'll be looking at something and it'll look amazing. And I'll try to watercolor it and try to get the space. But as soon as, I take pictures and I look at them later and I'm like, even with all those filters and things you can do with your phone now, and phones have incredible cameras in them, it just looks flat and sort of washed out. So as an artist, I think there are ways to make color create spatial tension. You can put a hot color next to a cool color and it'll jump. It visually, one will move forward or advance, or recede into space. And so I think I use every trick I can come up with to compose a composition that is visually engaging and as exciting as possible. And I think with the flowers and things like that, I try to be as accurate as I can. But someone, I think it was you, mentioned the surrealism aspect. And I grew up in the 60s, so I looked, I remember talking about this once before. I looked at those, like the Allman Brothers album covers, that were like psychedelic. And I grew up on that sort of, over intensified color and sort of exaggerated shapes. And it just became part of my sort of, my psyche about, composing things. And the beauty, I look at even this one, which, they all sort of have some semblance to foreground and middle ground and deep space there. What fun would it be to be an artist and just try to recreate what a camera can do? I'd rather, play with that and exaggerate certain things and, make things bigger than they would normally be and still have it. I guess the goal is to have it kind of still be believable and look like, oh, I recognize that bird or that, it's just, so I feel very liberated in that sense of being able to compose sort of emotionally or psychologically rather than literally. And I think my, not always conscious goal is to sort of make that still believable and not look overly sweet or, like sappy looking. I know I get real close to that sometimes, but it's, I don't know. That's a long answer. All my answers are long, but does that help?
So, Billy.
Yes?
When you came back from Big Bend when you were 15, did you come home and paint something?
I did drawings when I was there. They were pretty crude and not real. They were simple. But yeah, it was totally inspiring to me. Hey, Art, Sherry, nice to see y'all. Making a cameo appearance.
Thank you, Billy, so much.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.